I recently read a news article about a famous athlete who plays a team sport. I won't mention who it is, who, because they had an injury, decided to reject God, have nothing to do with God. Now, there wasn't much to do with God in this person's life before this. It wasn't like that they were a solid believer who all of a sudden moved to unbelief. This was someone who has taken some very public stands that are decidedly not aligned with biblical morality. And so, rather controversial figure. So it was interesting to read this article about their rejection of God because of an injury. A justification, the idea was, how can there be a God when this bad thing happened to me? I found it interesting because that is indicative of a reaction that many people have. And I've noticed this over the years. As people would come to me as a pastor for counseling when they have experienced a setback, when out of the blue there has been some diagnosis of an illness or some financial distress and trouble, and they come on a hard time in their life, and there's this sense of outrage that God would let this happen to them. Now, typically, this kind of response doesn't come from somebody who has been walking with the Lord, has a tight and close relationship with the Lord. In fact, I can't really think of anybody who's ever done that, who's had a healthy walk with God, a sense of communion and fellowship with God, a growing spiritual maturity, that has had a setback, that has thrown up their arms in the air and said, I can't believe that God has allowed this to happen to me. And I'm sure that there is somebody somewhere that's done that, probably lots of people, but I've never encountered anyone in my well over 40 years of being a Christian and walking with the Lord and being involved in ministry as a pastor. What I usually do hear that from is people who are marginal at best and sometimes have no interest in God. They're not churchgoers. They live their life without reference to God, and then something happens. Either they get sick or experience a financial setback, or someone close to them does, and they are outraged that God would let this happen to them. And as a result, the attitude is that they are going to punish God by being mad at him. Well, while as a pastor, I want to encourage people who are in that situation, who are at least now angry at God, to take that and to move it into a healthy direction. Well, that is what I want to do, and so I'm careful about how I respond. I'm just going to confess that inwardly, my response is, who do you think you are? You have lived your life without reference to God. You have no interest in God. You were not walking with God. There was no attention to spiritual matters. But when life doesn't go the way that you want it to, all of a sudden, God's the bad guy. All of a sudden, you think he owes you something. So you live your life without reference to him, assuming that is because God owes you a carefree life. And then the minute something bad happens, you're blaming it on God for his inattention to you. Just consider how filled with hypocrisy that reaction is, that mentality. To completely disregard God, to go about your life as you choose, not wanting God to have any kind of a say over your life. And then when things don't turn out the way that you want them to, all of a sudden now, God's to blame for that, as though he owed you. How can a person not see the hypocrisy in that? God doesn't owe anybody anything. He gives things because he is good and because of his grace. Apart from God's grace, people would experience loss and sorrow and grief all the time because we live in a fallen world that is cursed by sin. So this attitude of, I'm going to live any way I want, and I expect it to be smooth sailing, and the minute I get into choppy water. The minute some waves start to get into my boat, I'm going to shake my fist at heaven and say, God, you owe me smooth sailing. That makes no sense. Pastorally, what we ought to do with those people is to listen to them, to hear them out, to silence maybe the reaction we would like to give, who do you think you are? And instead say, what does your anger say about your assumptions about God? Why do you think that God owes you a carefree life? How have you been living up till now that would indicate that God should be giving you a carefree life? And direct all of that anger and that bitterness and that resentment that they have built up towards God because he did not give them what they wanted, and to use that as a means of saying, do you realize that what this reveals, your reaction here reveals about your expectations of God? Now let's compare that to what God says about himself. That if we deserve anything from God, it's judgment because of sin, and especially those people that have lived without regard towards him. In other words, what does God owe you? What God owes us in the sense of justice is judgment. He is holy. We are sinners. We have sinned. We are the ones that have done wrong. But God hasn't judged. In fact, what you're experiencing is the result. It's not God's fault. What you're experiencing in what's happened in your life that you're upset with, that you're unsettled by, is in fact the result of living in a fallen world, fallen because of the choices of human beings. That the gospel is the message that God has staged a rescue operation, that ultimately the kind of thing that you're experiencing right now need never happen again in terms of when the kingdom of God comes and he sets this fallen world right. So, who do people think they are that God owes them a carefree life? They're misunderstanding themselves and they're misunderstanding God.